Muy buenos días, sean bienvenidos a nuestra segunda conferencia magistral del día de hoy, a cargo de la doctora Syliane Charles, quien es profesora de filosofía en la Universidad de Québec a Trois-Rivières, en Canadá. Hizo su maestría en la Universidad de Nancy y su doctorado en la Universidad de Ottawa bajo la dirección de Graham Hunter, y estuvo durante algún tiempo también como investigadora postdoctoral en la Universidad de Montreal. El día de hoy nos va a presentar un texto que en español se titula Conciencia y afectos en Spinoza. Entonces, sin más dilación, le damos la palabra. Doctora, bienvenida. Gracias.
Thank you. And before starting, I definitely want to thank the organizers for inviting me. I love this country. Y hablo español también, pero para las preguntas va a ser posible que yo trate de hablar español, pero era más seguro para mí hacerlo en inglés para este momento. Gracias. The last paragraphs of the Ethics, or in both meanings of the term, the end of the ethics, uses the vocabulary of consciousness to refer to the type of knowledge achieved by the wise person. Quote, from what has been shown, this is the Syliane to proposition 42 in Ethics 5. From what has been shown, it is clear how much the wise man is capable of and how much more powerful he is than one who is ignorant and is driven only by lust. For not only is an ignorant man troubled in many ways by external causes and unable ever to possess true peace of mind, but he also lives as if he knew neither himself, nor God, nor things. And as soon as he ceases to be acted on, he ceases to be. On the other hand, the wise man, insofar as he is considered as such, is highly troubled in spirit, but being, by a certain necessity, conscious of himself, of God, and of things. Sui et Dei et rerum et aeterna qualia necessitate conscius. He never ceases to be, but always possesses true peace of mind. This paper will help us understand what exactly it means to be conscious of oneself, of God, and of things. I will maintain that consciousness can be understood as three elements. This is my personal definition of consciousness as self-knowledge, including an affective character. In particular, I will defend the view that consciousness comes in degrees, but that this incremental conception of the degrees of consciousness includes the degree zero, if we may call it that way, in contradistinction to the common view in the Spinoza literature nowadays. So let's turn to my first section. Self-consciousness redefines through the notion of objectivity. What we mean by consciousness in Spinoza's philosophy must be clarified before we carry on using this term. First of all, although we shall use a substantive form, consciousness or awareness in what follows, because it's a common way to talk about it in English, it must be noted that in Latin, Spinoza uses the adjective form to be conscious, conscius esse, instead, while he occasionally contrasts, which he occasionally contrasts with the fact of not being conscious, inscius esse, like in the quote of Syliane P42 Ethics 5 given above. Up to Spinoza's time period, the noun conscientia was used in a moral or theological framework, but it means to have a good or bad conscience as depending on one's actions. So it's translated as conscience and not consciousness in English. So this is something different. There's a possible confusion, which is important to lift when we talk about consciousness in English. The concept was thus not generalized as a term referring to the conscious mind yet, like it became the case after the publication of Locke's essay concerning the human understanding and the subsequent development of philosophy of mind in this wake. But there were a few uses in the epistemological sense nonetheless of derivatives from the radical Konski, which literally means to know with. This has led Daniel Garber in a recent paper to argue that there is simply no theory of consciousness in Spinoza, and that this statement at the end of the Ethics simply draws a line between those who have knowledge, like the wise person, and those who don't, like the ignorant. The precise analysis of all of Spinoza's uses of the term in Constitute's essay has been provided elsewhere, both by me and by others, so I cannot undertake to repeat it here. But here are the conclusions which I have reached. Consciousness, I shall argue against Garber and others, is theorized in Spinoza. Although it is not the subject of the definition per se, there's a consistent use of this concept by our author. And although it is not totally deprived of links with the concept of ideas, it should not primarily be looked for in these passages, like Stephen Lager and Don Garrett have already shown. The view that the theory of consciousness in Spinoza was found in Idea of Idea was first put forth by Curley and then taken over by Lee Rice as well. In my view, consciousness has three main characteristics in Spinoza: self-reference, cognitive content, and affective dimension. Let me explain these characteristics each at its time before I justify them through the text first. So consciousness in Spinoza is always self-consciousness. Consciousness should not primarily be understood as a phenomenal awareness of the world, like in common language or in contemporary philosophy of mind. Simply put, there is no awareness of the world per se in Spinoza, which explains the legitimate impression that there is no theory of consciousness in Spinoza, if by this we expect something akin to what philosophers of mind nowadays talk about. Before Garber, Jonathan Bennett had already quite famously claimed that Spinoza's conception of consciousness is confused and scattered, and that the ethics badly needs a theory of selective consciousness of which it contains no trace. End of quote. It is true that any consciousness in Spinoza is always primarily a consciousness of oneself, rather than primarily of the world. And his use of the term, which according to me is consistent, differs greatly in this respect from the contemporary meaning of the concept, which immediately points to phenomenal reality. Consciousness in Spinoza is always self-consciousness, because any awareness of the world goes through the way in which our power of acting is affected by it. In other terms, to be conscious of something means to feel how it affects our self, the latter being then known to us through these affections. And here we could compare Spinoza's view with Kant's notion of the unknowability in itself of the noumenon, since the subject only perceives it through its own filters that actually construct it. For Spinoza too, like in Kant, everything goes through our body and our connection, so that the external world is never known in itself, as an object in itself. It is only ever a phenomenon for us, we may want to see. So this is what I wanted to explain by what I mean by self-consciousness. Self is primary, although of course the consciousness of the world is there too, but as the way it affects us. So second point, consciousness refers to a knowledge of oneself. Simply put, there's a clear cognitive element included in the term, to the point that, as we shall see in the quotes given below, Spinoza equals self-knowledge with the fact of being conscious. This, I believe, is the least controversial element of the three which I put in my personal definition of consciousness. Third element, consciousness refers to a knowledge of oneself, which includes an affective dimension. This point is at the core of my reading of consciousness in Spinoza, and it is not presently acknowledged in the Spinoza literature. I hold that there is no affect. I hold that if there is no affect, there is no self-consciousness, no awareness of anything for Spinoza. This is a claim which is not as directly clear from the text as the two above, but which can be deduced from the text, as I shall argue. So, to put the three keywords together in one single definition, consciousness in Spinoza, as I understand it, is an effective knowledge of oneself. If there's one thing you want to retain from this paper, it is that. Consciousness is an effective knowledge of oneself. When these three conditions obtain, namely the necessary reference to the self, cognition, and affectivity, Spinoza says that we are conscious, and he uses this term in preference to that of mere cognitio or having an idea of something. Let us justify these three claims through the text now. The two first conditions are proven by the fact that Spinoza himself explicitly equated self-knowledge with consciousness of oneself. In Ethics 2, Proposition 23, he talked about the knowledge that the mind has of itself. And when referring to this proposition in the demonstration to E3P9, he talked about its self-consciousness itself. Let's read that. Proposition 23, Ethics 2. The mind does not know itself except insofar as it perceives the ideas of the affections of the body. Now, demonstration to E3P9. But since the mind, by 2P23, is necessarily conscious of itself through ideas of the body's affections, the mind, by P7, is conscious of its private purity. This is the clearest identification of self-knowledge with self-consciousness that we can find in Spinoza's works. It indicates to the reader that Spinoza's theory of consciousness has to be looked for primarily in his theory of self-knowledge, and not in the theory of ideas like the arising of the spot. I agree on this with the student matter on character. In passing, it may be noted that this self-knowledge, or cognoscentia sensus, is also equated here with the consciousness of one's conatus, something which will have its importance in the rest of my argument below. So, the mind only knows itself through the ideas of its body's affections, that is, by feeling its own body as it is affected by others. This is where the third element, which I see in Spinoza's conception, comes into play. The mind's self-consciousness only obtains when an affect or feeling is given. To understand this last feature of consciousness in Spinoza, we must recall the difference between an affection, affectio, and an affect, affectus, in Spinoza, in order to make clear that all modes have affections, but not all modes have affects. So a little bit of explanation so that we can interpret that. An affection, what is it? An affection is a mode of being, that is, the modification of a thing in act, meaning in Spinoza vocabulary and of an existing thing. This is, as it turns out, the very definition of a mode. Let's look at the definition 5 in Ethics 1. By mode, I understand the affections of a substance. All bodies have a corresponding mind, which contains the ideas of the body's affections, which, at least in the case of the human mind, can be called the mind's perception of this body. This is E2P12. And because of the equality of all attributes expressed in 2P7, its corollary and scholium, we must extend this understanding of the idea of the body as the idea of that body to all corporeal things in the world. To put it differently, all modes in the world have affections corresponding to the various states which they take in their lifetime, in the way corresponding to the way in which they are modified and in which they modify substance. And all ideas corresponding to these things have corresponding affections as well. In other terms, all minds have ideas of their body's affections, meaning that they are ideas of their body's affections. A statement very similar to what Spinoza develops in E2P11 to 13. So, all existing things are continuously affected in the sense of being modified. Affections are everywhere, and they are given all the time for a given existing mode, since all things are continuously in contact with the external world. As we know, we are not the dominion within a dominion, as Spinoza puts it in the preface to Ethics 3. But this does not mean that all things can be affected in the affectus sense, which is the meaning which we usually have in mind when we say that something affects us or that we feel it. Spinoza presents it as an axiom in the beginning of the second part of the Ethics. Axiom 3. There are no modes of thinking such as love, desire, or whatever is designated by the word affects of the mind, unless there is in the same individual the idea of the thing loved, desired, and the like. But there can be an idea even though there is no other mode of thinking. It should be noted that this axiom stands in Ethics 2, namely before Spinoza defined what he meant by affects, which will be done in Ethics 3. At this point, he had not even used this word yet, affectus, and even less defined it, which he will do in E3 definition 3. The last sentence of the quote, properly understood, says it very explicitly. There can be an idea that does not include any of the other modes of thinking, such as those described, love, desire, that is, affects. In other words, although there can be no affect without an idea, there can be an idea without any affects. How is this possible? The key to understanding this lies in the definition of an affect. An affect, affectus, by Spinoza, is an affection of the body and its idea in the mind when this affection entails a change in our power of acting. So let's read definition 3. By affect, I understand the affections of the body by which the body's power of acting is increased or diminished, aided or restrained, and at the same time, the ideas of these affections. Chantal Jacquet has a very nice analysis of the subtle difference between increasing and aiding the body's acting of power on the one hand, as well as between diminishing or restraining it on the other hand, one being related to one's own effort, the other being related to external circumstances. So they are not exact synonyms. But what matters for us is that in both cases, it is the power of acting which is modified, either for the better or for the worse. And what is this power of acting if not the conatus itself? Hence, we will reformulate this definition in light of the scholium to proposition 11 in Ethics 3, in which Spinoza explains that the three primary affects are what three primary affects are, namely desire, cupiditas, which is nothing but the appetite, insofar as it is conscious, joy, laetitia, and sadness, tristitia. So, let's read the quote. I have explained in P9S what desire is, and apart from these three, namely desire, joy, and sadness, I do not acknowledge any primary affect, for I shall show below in what follows that the rest will rise from these three. This is where I base my main argument for the third element in my definition of consciousness, namely that consciousness is included in all affects. For I take the texts to mean that joy, sadness, and all their variants are just ways in which the primary of all affects, namely cupiditas or desire, is expressed. And Spinoza insists on it for no apparent reason in Ethics 3 proposition 9 scholium. If we don't grant him the theory of consciousness, desire is the appetite itself together with consciousness of itself. And this is reminiscent of the things you may have heard in Daniel Garber's paper 2 days ago. So let's read this important scholium. When this striving is related only to the mind, it is called will. But when it is related to the mind and body together, it is called appetite. This striving, of course, we're talking about the conatus here. This appetite, therefore, is nothing but the very essence of man, from whose nature there necessarily follow those things that promote his preservation. And so man is determined to do those things. Between appetite and desire, there is no difference except that desire is generally related to men insofar as they are conscious of their appetite. It is desire which is, along with joy and sadness, one of the three primary affects. And since it is the very essence of all beings, I would like to argue that it is the very, very primary affect of all affects. As I see it, all affects are variations of our desire. Joyful variations when this desire is fulfilled, sad variations when this desire is thwarted by means. Errol Harris already expressed a similar view in his introduction to Spinoza's philosophy, quote, these are the three primary affects, desire, pleasure, pain, and the last two are really only differentiations of the first, attraction and aversion, end of quote. If indeed desire is at the core of all possible affects, and not simply the conatus or appetite, it must be because all affects include what is specific to desire when compared with appetite of the conatus, namely self-consciousness, according to the scholium 2, proposition 9 in Ethics 3. And another specificity comes along the fact to have an appetite, which must also be contained in its conscious form, that is desire. The mind, through it, is determined to do something, Spinoza tells us. This was already expressed in 3.9 scholium, when he said, this appetite therefore is nothing but the very essence of man, from whose nature there necessarily follow those things that promote his preservation, and so man is determined to do those things. Spinoza insists on it again in the definition of desire, in the definition of the affects, where desire, it is worth noticing again, is defined before all the other affects. So, affectum definitiones 1. Desire is man's very essence, insofar as determined from any